Welcome to this webinar on effective performance management with a focus on getting the best from your staff. I'm Marie Aguilar, a director at the HR Services Partnership. And what we do at the HR Services Partnership is provide HR support to smaller charities, which can be anything from responding to day-to-day queries, carrying out specific projects, or providing a completely outsourced HR department. And we're very pleased to have been an NCVO trusted supplier since 2010. A large part of our work involves supporting managers in addressing performance issues, as well as working with senior teams to drive productivity and develop high-performing teams. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Annabelle Cary, Managing Consultant at the HR Services Partnership, and together we'll be drawing on our experience for today's webinar. Hello, Annabelle. I'm really pleased you could join us today. Just remind us, what are we going to be covering today?
Right, we will explore the importance of setting the right environment and the importance of ensuring managers have the skills and confidence to intervene early when a problem begins to emerge. We'll also explore the importance of knowing your staff, their abilities and preferred styles, and to adapt your management style accordingly. So good morning, everyone. We will start with focusing on the role of the manager in today's work context, which is evolving, how to set standards and expectations and monitor against those, and feedback on progress. And we'll finish the session by looking at the essential steps required to address unsatisfactory performance.
That's great, thanks, Annabelle. There's certainly quite a bit to cover in the 45 minutes that we have. And at the end of the session, we'll be asking you to complete a questionnaire. We'll then take some questions which you can type in on the box on your right. Now, I understand we've got one or two technical difficulties, so I'm hoping that you will be able to type questions as we go along, and we'll certainly do our best to answer those. But if there is a problem, then there is a slide at the end with our email details. If you have any queries about what we've spoken about today, you're very welcome to get in touch with us. Rob and Hannah are our technical support team here, and they'll field me your questions as they come through. Now, we're recording this session, so those of you who haven't been able to attend can still watch the seminar. And everyone who registered will receive a link to the webinar video in a few days' time. Do feel free to share it with your colleagues. Okay, let's make a start. Annabelle.
So we'll start with a little poll before we start. Can you let us know why are you attending today's webinar? So are you a manager with an immediate performance management issue, or are you responsible for HR wanting to improve your organizational practices? Are you in HR attending for your own personal development, or are you a manager attending for your own personal development? It'd be useful for us to see who's there today.
Okay, let's see what's coming through then. I think certainly in our experience, managers have nearly always got an immediate performance management problem coming through. I think a lot of them, though, are issues that managers can see brewing.
Yes. Okay, so there's a good mix out there today.
Yeah, all right. Yes, responsible for HR and wanting to improve things in your organisation. Or you're a manager. A lot of people are managers attending for their own personal development. Well, we certainly think that we'll be able to give you some tips and some hints and thoughts today. Okay, let's move on then. I'm sure you will have heard this before. Employees join a company but leave a manager. The line manager is key in motivating and retaining staff and getting the best from them. So before we explore performance management in detail, let's look at the context in which you as managers have to operate. The people management context has evolved hugely in recent years, and the world of work continues to change at a pace. Annabelle, how does this impact on the way we manage our staff?
Well, one important aspect is the evolution of the psychological contract. What we mean by the psychological contract, it's what employee and employer expect from one another in the employment relationship, and this has evolved in the last decade, especially with the changes of the workforce. For example, the millennials generation has different expectations from work. You will probably relate to this. They often expect self-fulfillment from their work, speedy development and progression in their role, or even from one organization to another. They also typically relate less to the hierarchical, more traditional approach to management. Another factor you might relate to as well is the rise of the carers workforce, and in particular the sandwich generation, which include those staff who care for both their children and the elderly parents, which obviously will present a lot of challenges. Now, these factors will impact both on the type of performance issues that may arise, but also in the requirements of managers to understand their staff's needs and then to adapt accordingly to those.
Okay, so in this context, the role of a manager does appear to be quite challenging.
Yes, more than ever. And of course, the role of the manager is central to organizational effectiveness. A useful model to illustrate this is the 3 circles from John Adair's Action-Centered Leadership. Although it was devised in the 70s, we find it still relevant today, and it helps to show the constant tensions placed on managers to, 1, deliver the task and manage the team, whilst meeting the individual team members' needs, which in small, medium-sized charities will be of particular challenge.
I think any of us that are managers will relate to this. It is incredibly difficult to maintain that balance between all these 3 factors. So what we'd like to do, quick poll here, which of these 3 elements do you currently devote most of your energy to? Is it the needs of the task, maintaining the team's needs, or individual needs? Let's have a look at this. I mean, I think for me at the moment, I would say it's the team maintenance needs. What about you, Annabelle?
Yes, definitely. And also sometimes, especially when you're recruiting new staff, you will have to devote more energy and time in ensuring those staff are inducted appropriately. So the balance is really difficult to maintain at all times. So what do we have? Let's have a look at the results.
Okay. Task needs. Interesting. Mind you, quite closely followed by individual needs.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? You almost apply the 80-20 rule here, that 20% of your staff will give you 80% of the time and energy you've got to put into it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, in this context, high performance may be described differently from one organization to the next. But there are 2 key elements that you will be looking at. The first one is competence, i.e. is the employee able to do the job? And then the second is motivation. Does the employee actually want to do the job?
So how can you make sure that staff have both the competence and the motivation to do the job?
Well, there are lots of theories about motivation, some quite simple, others much more complex. But it seems that a fundamental aspect of them is that staff will perform better if they know what is expected of them, if they receive regular feedback, but also it's widely demonstrated that an environment of trust, openness, has a direct positive impact on motivation and performance.
Yes, and of course, another element that helps both competence and motivation is the ability to provide staff with the opportunity for development, which we've seen is particularly valued by the younger generation, particularly the millennials that you referred to earlier on.
Yeah, that's true.
So starting with the expectations, this is the first key step.
Yes. We see many situations where when someone is challenged about their poor performance, they reply that they didn't really know what was expected of them. Now, particularly where managers don't hold regular one-to-one meetings, or objectives aren't set, or where job descriptions are maybe out of date and they don't reflect the role as it is.
Okay, so how can we make sure that expectations are clear?
Well, crucially, setting standards and expected outcomes start when recruiting for the role. As early as even the advertising stage, you're setting the tone, and the way you will word your advert and draft your job description and person spec will have an important part to play. So the person spec in particular should be prepared very carefully so that you set out the expected levels of knowledge, experience, even before the employee has started. And also you'll be able to refer to these again when managing the employee's performance and defining any development needs.
And of course, the induction also plays an important role.
Yes. The induction process should be considered much more as an induction program rather than a first-day process to tick boxes. Now, the induction should do more than imparting key information, such as advising of procedures or giving a copy of the staff handbook. You should include insight into your strategic aims and also the culture in place. How do we do things around here?
Yeah, sometimes we think that the recruitment job is done, completed once the employee starts, but the onboarding process is really important. Those first few weeks and months can establish rapport and commitment. This is also true, I think, of the probationary period.
Yeah, we know from experience that clients with structured probationary periods, in other words, where clear objectives, a development plan, and regular reviews are held, have more successful outcomes. When considering the high cost and difficulty of recruiting in our sector, it's essential to invest adequate time and thought in performance management during the probationary period. Now, although it may feel really disheartening, if you clearly identify during probation that a new recruit does not meet your requirements, it is likely to be more efficient to terminate the employment, or at least extend the probation around a set objectives and review the process. But we will cover some of this later on.
I absolutely agree. It's difficult to make that decision to dismiss someone, but if they're showing clear evidence that they're not meeting your requirements during the probationary period, then there's a really good opportunity to make that difficult decision. But besides a robust probationary period, what else can be used to set clear expectations?
Well, it's important to have good employment contract that sets out the relationship clearly, and a staff handbook with relevant user-friendly policies as well.
Yes, and I have to say, we run workshops for some of our clients to help launch their staff handbook to both managers and staff. And despite the fact that it doesn't seem the most exciting topic in the world, they're generally well received because in our experience, both staff and managers do see the value of having policies and a shared common understanding of expectations.
Yes. Now, some organizations also have a competency framework in place which supports their core values and also the behaviors they expect from everyone. If introduced and managed effectively, this can be very useful in embedding the organizational culture.
And the appraisal process will also play a key role.
Yes. However, the traditional annual appraisal process is changing, and we see a shift in many organizations towards a more embedded process. Now, this relies on more regular one-to-one meetings, which can feed into a performance review discussion once or twice a year. And this tends to be a more effective way to drive both competence as well as motivation. The focus then is on the ongoing dialogue rather than what can be quite an artificial process once a year, detached from the day-to-day and the ongoing work that has taken place during the year. Now, here, objectives are not set up once a year, but instead they are objectives with shorter time frames set regularly as part of one-to-ones. It's a much more dynamic process.
Yeah, and as you say, Annabelle, it's a practice that we are seeing a change in the focus of the way appraisals are carried out is something we're seeing increasingly amongst our clients. So it clearly helps to have competent staff, but how can you ensure they're also motivated?
Well, it really helps first if the manager is motivated themselves. So think about your own situation, what role model behavior do you display? That's really important here. Staff well-being is also clearly identified as an essential component of high performance. So think about what you are doing in your organizations to try to help identify and address any issues with staff well-being. But what we find underpins a lot of these factors is the extent to which a manager knows their staff. And by that, I mean having an understanding of their abilities, but also their work interest and how they think. Investing a little time in this will pay dividends later.
But it isn't just about taking time to chat over lunch. It's also about understanding your team members' individual take on work, knowing that each will have different needs from their managers.
Yes, that's true. And our staff will all have their preferred styles of working, different personalities. And I think more and more managers see the value in exploring this. There are many tools to help improve awareness and understanding of how individual style affects the way we function and interact, and how ultimately this impacts on individual and team performance.
Yeah, and although they are sometimes criticised, there is increasing recognition of the value of using psychometric tools in helping managers understand their teams.
Yeah, and at HRSP we use them in a variety of interventions, and one particularly useful tool is the Insights Discovery tool. It helps people understand their own preferred working styles and that of their colleagues. And for example, where do you sit on the introvert-extrovert scale, whether you are task-focused or more people-focused, and how this impacts on your interactions.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about how this works in practice.
Well, if you look at this slide, this is a simple way of illustrating how different people react to stress, for example. Now, some of us prefer to hide away with a bit of peace and quiet, whilst others want to share and with their colleagues and their help with a hug. So, you know, looking at this slide, would you relate more to the man on the left or the woman on the right? Give it some thought. And how would that impact on the dynamic of the team or the dynamic of the project if you're working with a very diverse group of people who are, you know, on one side, much more on the introverted side of the scale, with other people much more extroverted. Another example will be in different approaches to work. So we will all know what I mean when I talk about people who seem to be happy working in organized chaos, whilst others have a very orderly and detailed approach to tasks. So no name, Maria, but I think we can all relate to that.
I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Now, on a serious note, for managers, it will be particularly useful to understand whether their team member has a preference for a structured approach, needing clear and comprehensive detail and plenty of planning time before starting to work on a project, or whether they prefer to be thrown into a wide variety of projects, relishing a fast-paced environment with high level of interaction with others. Now, the Insights 4 color energies help identify those preferences. So again, you know, give it a few seconds, look at those 4 color energies, and would you relate more yourself to the cool blue style, the fiery red, the earth green, or the sunshine yellow? Now, when we run sessions with a group of people, a team, you will find people who really feel strongly that their preference is to do things right, as opposed to others who will put the focus on doing things together. Yeah. Others, again, will prefer to do things now and get things done and delivered. Others will put the focus on actually ensuring that there's harmony and consensus in the team. Now, this will have a huge incidence on how an individual will approach, how they will enjoy their work, and it will also help the manager identify what they can do to maximize those chances of success for their staff. Now, looking at how this applies in how you would approach a performance review, for example.
Okay, so it clearly helps to know your staff well and understand how best they can perform depending on their preferred styles. What else will help improve both competence as well as motivation?
Well, we find that regular one-to-one meetings are essential. And even if the manager sits close to their team members, you may take the view that you're constantly speaking to one another, so you don't need any supervision meetings. But it's actually quite different to take some time out, away from the office environment, to have a more in-depth discussion with your staff. It's also a great opportunity to feed back to one another and also bring up anything that may not have been appropriate to raise in an open plan environment, for example, and also a bit less focus on the task list.
Okay, so what should these meetings look like?
Well, they don't have to be overly structured, although it may help to have some key headings for a productive discussion. For example, we recommend that you discuss current workload priorities, but also any support needs. You should also consider covering progress on objectives and development plans. And it's very valuable to make specific references to any recent achievements that should be highlighted and discussed. Now, positive feedback is as important as constructive or developmental feedback. And reinforcing positive behavior is a great way to learn. I often find when I run my one-to-ones with my team that I'm actually the one flagging recent achievements and highlights of good client work they've done, and they've already forgotten about it because they've been focused on the next task. So it's a really good opportunity for people to really take stock, look back, and actually benefit from all the great work that they've done and take that forward to the next piece of work. You can then discuss any other matters before confirming any actions agreed. A simple template form can be used to capture the key points covered, and these can be extremely useful reference points when planning the 6 to 12 months appraisal meeting.
Yeah, and what we know, of course, is that clients who use this approach tend to be very positive about it. It provides a helpful framework for regular dialogue and reinforces the development of an open and productive work environment, clarity of standards and expectations. And this ties in very much to what we were talking about earlier on in terms of the appraisals and the way appraisals are changing from having one big appraisal meeting once a year with half a dozen objectives to more regular meetings that are a little bit meatier with ongoing objectives.
Yeah, this also lends itself well to develop a coaching approach if this is something you would like to embed in your management culture in the organization.
So one-to-ones are a key element of driving effective performance, but also they maintain motivation. But we find that managers are sometimes reluctant to hold one-to-ones, often because there may be some difficult feedback to give. And let's face it, who relishes having to give difficult feedback?
Yes, that's true, but it will be much easier to give if you're confident about the message you want to give. So if you are clear about the impact that the underperformance is having, and you are clear that you've talked about those standards you do expect from the outset and in your one-to-ones, then it will be easier to remind them of the discussions you've had, what you've agreed, and give examples of current work, and then talk about the gap. You might find it helpful here to refer to the job descriptions or the person specification as an aid to those discussions as well.
And presumably if you have a competency framework, it'd be a useful tool here too.
Yes, yes. You should also consider what approach is likely to be most effective with this particular member of staff. So for example, do they need the direct, straight to the point approach? Or is it someone who will need more gentle coaching? Now think of the insights color energies we've just referred to earlier.
Yeah.
Remember that a key objective of these discussions is to identify any causes of the performance gap. So you need to keep focusing on that. Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it that they're having trouble sleeping and focusing maybe? It's important to understand these as early as possible so that the adequate approach can be taken and solutions explored with the employee.
Yeah, I'm sure we're all familiar with situations where performance issues are caused by the employee's personal circumstances, such as difficulties at home, problems with childcare and work pattern, or lack of training.
Yeah, and identifying these as early as possible to be able to resolve matters before they have too much impact is essential. Now, of course, it's possible that performance issues may be due to a physical or a mental health condition. Managing capability issues linked to ill health is really a complex topic, which unfortunately we do not have time to cover today, but which will require careful management.
So we've discussed the importance of setting a robust people management framework, which provides clear expectations, regular monitoring, and feedback on performance, both positive and negative. But even with all these in place, there are still instances where performance is still not acceptable.
Yeah, the manager will need first to identify whether you are still at the informal stage or whether you've moved from that. So let's have a look at the experience around the webinar here, the audience. So how many of you have had to dismiss for capability before? Let's have a look.
So we've got a yes and no, or one in progress.
Yes.
There may be some people here who are currently dealing with an issue.
And you're probably joining the webinar for that reason. So let's have a look at what we've got.
Yeah. Never an easy one. Yeah. And we do sometimes find that the lack of dealing with issues when they should be dealt with as a capability might even lead to other ways. Managers attempted to lead to decide on other ways to deal with it. Okay, so we've got the results in, and it seems the majority of you have dismissed staff before for poor performance. And there are a few of you that have situations in progress.
Yeah, now for those of you, actually, 55%, so it's quite a large amount. You will all be very aware that how time-consuming it can be, how bruising it can be in some cases, and sometimes how expensive it can be. However, the majority of performance management issues can be addressed at the informal level.
Yeah, I think it's really important to realise that before you start a formal process, you need to be able to show, it's so much better to be able to show that you've had a number of informal discussions, that you've tried to address this situation informally first. In other words, that you've explained what was needed in at least a couple of the one-to-one meetings. And make sure, of course, that you've got notes of any meetings in which you've discussed performance. It's worth considering as well putting together a performance improvement plan. These are often called PIPs, which will capture the key issues, the improvement targets and the deadlines. Also, the support that will be provided by you or the organisation. It should include a date for the next review as well. Now, this doesn't have to be a complex document. A simple table template can be used and can be very, very effective.
Yeah, so this is still the informal stage, but sometimes a formal process is justified.
Absolutely, where the performance issues have been clearly set out and the employee has been given a chance to improve, but still isn't meeting the standards, you should absolutely consider moving to the formal process.
Now, is it worth clarifying, Maria, what we mean by the formal process?
Okay, it's formal in the sense that it falls under the legal and contractual framework for managing staff performance or conduct. So you should be following the ACAS code of practice. And we would say that the first thing you want to do is ask yourself whether you're dealing with a capability or a conduct issue. We recommend that you have a separate policy for dealing with performance issues where the employee is unable rather than unwilling to perform. A capability or performance improvement policy will help with you to put together a more appropriate approach with a focus on providing support and guidance to the employee as far as you reasonably can.
Okay, so how would we implement a formal capability process?
Well, begin by ensuring you've got a good, up-to-date policy and that you're familiar with it. It's also helpful to have an understanding of how it's actually being applied across the organisation, so that there's consistency in what constitutes poor performance and at what point the formal process is likely to be triggered. You don't have to issue a formal, or you don't want to issue, should I say, you don't want to be in a situation where you issue a formal warning to someone who's failed to follow a particular procedure, only to find that someone else didn't follow the procedure and didn't receive a warning for doing the same thing.
Yeah, being able to show consistency across the organization will help prevent any complaints of unfair or even discriminatory treatment. So it's very important.
Yeah, and the procedure that you would follow are the same sort of standard steps. You'd invite the employee to a meeting and, of course, give them the right to be accompanied by a work colleague or a trade union representative. Ensure that the employee has details of the performance concerns well in advance of the meeting so that they can prepare. And you'd usually include those in the letter that asks them to attend the meeting. The employee should also be made aware of the possible outcomes of the meeting so that they can gauge the seriousness of this. So is it something that might lead to a first stage warning, a final stage warning, or in very, very serious situations, even possible dismissal? And we recommend that the employee is given a copy of your policy so that they can clearly understand the framework that you're working to.
So how do you carry out the capability hearing?
Well, at the meeting, it's helpful to have a separate note taker so that you can concentrate on the content of the discussion and on ensuring the meeting is effective. However, this is likely to make the meeting quite formal in tone and in some cases might exacerbate the anxiety that the employee feels and even affect a positive outcome for the discussion. So you'll have to take a view about whether you have a note taker or not, but we would certainly always recommend having a note taker if the employee is bringing a companion, especially if they're a union representative.
So is a capability meeting structured the same way as a disciplinary meeting?
Well, yes and no. The structure is likely to be the same in the sense that you would want to go through the details of your concerns, give examples, and give the individual the opportunity to respond. So that's the right to respond. You also want to remind them, but then where it begins to differ is that you would want to remind them of any support that you have provided to date, and also of the informal procedure that's taken place up until now. So remind them of the one-to-one meetings you've had and the discussions that have already taken place. And of course, if you've used a performance improvement plan already, you'll need to show that they've failed to deliver the required improvements. And then, of course, explore the possible causes for the underperformance. If you've undertaken a thorough informal process, it's unlikely that people will bring up any new factors, but don't assume this. It could be that now that you've made the process formal, the employee decides to open up. And remember, you're not responsible for solving any or the underlying causes, only doing what you reasonably can as an employer.
So what will affect the decision to issue a formal warning or not?
Well, again, consider how sanctions have been applied in the past across the team and the wider organisation to make sure that you have a consistent approach. Ensure that you're confident that the employee was given very clear feedback and support at the informal stage and the opportunity to improve their performance. Ask yourself, if the employee appeals, will he or she have a good case? Take account of any mitigating circumstances. You must also feel confident that the demands placed on the employee are reasonable, especially in terms of workload and or seniority and level of experience.
So where you feel it's reasonable in the circumstances to issue the formal warning, you can then confirm this to the employee.
Yes, although you should adjourn the meeting before making that decision for at least half an hour. This will help you think through anything that's come out of the discussion. And if you feel you need to take longer to make the decision, then simply explain that you need to think about it overnight or even a few days if you feel that you need to explore anything further.
So any formal action must be confirmed in writing, indicating how long it will remain a live warning, and obviously the employee must be given the right of appeal.
Absolutely. But besides any formal warning, ultimately your objective is to improve performance, so you'll still want to have a plan of action.
That's true, but that's really key. Whether you've already used a performance improvement plan or not, you will need to be clear about the improvement targets of the employee and put in place any support initiative agreed with review dates.
And the process, I guess, doesn't end there.
No, you must close the loop. Monitor progress during the agreed review period and make sure those review meetings do take place as planned. This is very important for the integrity of the process and any potential next steps if you need to take the procedure further.
And of course, of equal importance, you must give feedback and on any positive feedback on progress.
Yes, ultimately, that is what you are looking for. This is what we've been talking about today. The idea is to improve the performance. So encourage and reinforce any improvements. Now, unfortunately, there are cases where performance does not improve sufficiently.
Okay.
Yes.
So, however, if you have followed all these steps, you will be in a better position to take the process further. Again, you would need to establish with the employee that they've not met the agreed objectives and the targets of the performance improvement plan, and then invite them to a further meeting in line with your policy. So if you like, the process becomes a little bit cyclical and you've got to rerun it. Invite them to another meeting, another letter, another right to be accompanied, etc.
Okay. So hopefully this has given you a good overview and useful ideas around how to get the best from your staff, and if needed, how to tackle unsatisfactory performance. So we have a few key points there to flag the key messages from today's webinar.
And I see that we've got some questions here from you. We have a question from Amanda. Amanda says that she has a member of staff that's accrued a very large amount of flexi time without prior permission. They work part-time, so they've acted outside of policy. Attempts to address the situation are falling on deaf ears and are unable to, and this member of staff is unable to increase hours due to finances. They've suggested that we wipe these flexi time hours down to a management amount, not supposed to carry over the hours. So how do we deal with this? Okay, well, I guess this one is possibly not about capability and performance improvement, more about potentially a disciplinary situation. But what you really want to do with this person is be absolutely clear what your policy says. And of course, we know that flexi-time policies can be a bit of a nightmare. They never seem to, it doesn't matter how clearly you think you've written them, they do have their problems. They never seem to be, quite clear enough. But I think that what you might need to do with this one is establish what the policy says, see whether she's complied with the policy. If she hasn't complied with the policy, then you certainly don't need to pay those hours. You might though want to reach some sort of compromise and draw a line. Make the point that from this point forward, you're going to be dealing with things differently. Okay.
Yeah, I agree. Question from Leanne. So how would this process differ for someone during their probationary period?
That's a really good question. So in terms of the probationary period, we all know that individuals don't have the right to claim unfair dismissal until they've been with you for 2 years. However, they still have the opportunity to make claims on all sorts of other things around discrimination or breach of contract. So we think it's always advisable to follow the ACAS code of practice, even if you're dismissing someone within the probationary period. So still follow a fair process. Write to them, invite them to a meeting, tell them what the meeting's about, give them the right to be accompanied, put the matters to them, listen to what they have to say, and give them the right to appeal.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think sometimes we have clients who think, oh, this employee is under 2-year service, so we're not taking any risks. We can just dismiss them the Alan Sugar way of management. And those days are long gone. You need to take a really fair approach, and you need to be able to justify of your decision. So we've got a question from Mel. What if someone raises a grievance as soon as I start to manage their performance?
Okay, so...
And that happens often. We often manage cases where, you're trying to manage your member of staff, but suddenly they raise a grievance against you, saying that they haven't been managed the right way.
Absolutely. And the answer to this, you have to be patient. You have to follow a fair and reasonable process. It may be very frustrating, but look at it objectively and ask yourself, is it related to the process underway? Which means the process must be paused so that the grievance can be investigated first, or can the two processes be run concurrently? Or is it possible for a griever, for the grievance they've raised to be dealt with within the current capability process that you're dealing with? I mean, the key thing here is if they've raised issues, they must be looked into, they must be responded to. But you do have options in terms of how you do that. Always act reasonably, though.
Yeah.
Okay. And I see we've got a question here from Paul. Paul asks, if someone can do certain aspects of their job very well and others not well, despite PIPs, can you change their job description in consultation with them, even if they're reluctant to do this? Annabelle, do you want to answer that question?
Well, it really depends. I think you need to really go back to what is the role requirement. Is it that actually you could tweak the role to make the most of the strength of the employee, and therefore you may be able to find a resolution through discussions, tweaking the role, and almost find a win-win situation where both the employee is happy with this new role profile, you know, the makeup of the role, and it actually serves the objectives and the requirement of the charity. But where you find yourself, you know, you cannot change the job description because you actually need that work being done, you will need to consider whether it is a performance issue, it is a capability issue. So I think that there is, the consultation can only go so far. You also would look at what other opportunities exist within the organization. So is it a case where you could have a role transfer? But we find that with small clients, small charities, you don't often have many opportunities outside of the roles that exist. So it could be a capability process there.
Yeah, for me, what strikes me about that question is, you know, you say, Paul, that the member of staff is reluctant to change their job description. That raises for me the question about whether they accept that they're not doing an aspect of the job well.
Yeah.
And you get to the point as well where, you know, you've issued various PIPs, you're working with them. Remember that a PIP can be a very positive thing. You know, you're making it clear what you expect and you're providing support to do that. There comes a point at which you've got to say, well, do you know what? Do we need to move on to the formal process? So I think, you know, Annabelle's approach, stay positive, try to do, you know, try to move them on. My approach is actually ask yourself when enough is enough.
Yeah, and again, as we discussed in the webinar, a key point is understanding the root of the issue. Is there something more to this? You know, is there a reason why they're not performing in certain areas of the role? So that's something worth exploring carefully before you decide which way you're going to go.
And I see that Leanne is asking, how would a settlement agreement work? Okay, bit of a minefield.
We need a webinar just for that question, I think.
We absolutely do. But let's see if we can answer that quite briefly. So we all know that settlement agreements came about some time ago to replace compromise agreements. So you don't have to have a pre-existing dispute in order to raise the issue of, you know, raise a question with the employee about a settlement agreement. Now, there is a code of practice, an ACAS code of practice on settlement agreements, and there's also guidance. It's very long, but it does provide some very, you know, some really useful stuff. The key aspects are that I would say that, you know, if you've got somebody with a performance issue and you have done your very best to try and resolve that, and it's still a problem and you're stuck, you can't seem to be able to move the situation on, then it does provide, a settlement agreement does provide you with an opportunity to have a conversation with that person. And the conversation might be along the lines of, look, you and I, we've been talking about our concerns for some time. We've now reached the stage where it seems to us that we've got one of two options. We can either follow a formal performance management process, which would look like this, or we can agree to have a confidential conversation in respect of a settlement agreement.
Protected conversations.
Indeed. And of course, if you do that, you do need to follow the ACAS code of practice on this and also the guidance. So be careful about how you approach that conversation and ensure that the individual has time to think about it. And of course, they will need to seek legal advice to make it valid.
Yeah, any agreement will have to be taken to a solicitor. So it's very important that you've done things really by the book to make sure that it is valid and it doesn't end up costing you more than it should. We would recommend you take advice, you know, if you're approaching this kind of situation.
Yeah. What we find, of course, is that settlement agreements can be hugely used. They can be really, really useful tools. But think carefully before you enter into that discussion, because it's a sort of no going back. You know, if you have that conversation with your member of staff and they say, no, I'm not interested, I want to carry on working. How do you go back from that? Yeah. It's very, very difficult.
You have to think 2 steps ahead and what are the options if if the negotiation don't actually reach a satisfactory conclusion. So to approach cautiously, but in many situations it can be a good outcome for both parties. Now, ultimately, we are trying to ensure that managers preempt any kind of issues like this, and that they do get the best from their staff, and actually that the staff gets the best from their managers. That's why we're here today. But hopefully that's given you a few ideas as to how to tackle the more tricky, the more difficult issues.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of the webinar today. So I just want to thank you all for attending. I hope that you have found it useful. And just to remind you that NCVO will be sending you a survey for you to complete. And we'd really appreciate your feedback on that. So from me, Maria Aguilar, and my colleague, Annabelle Cary, and from the technical support team, Rob and Hannah, so we want to say goodbye. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope you'll attend the next one.
And we hope to speak to some of you in the future. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.